Welcome, everybody. We're going to get started and get underway. Thank you so much for spending some of your afternoon or morning with us. This is the Springer Publishing webinar series, and today we are having a great presentation from Dr. Giordano. Can you really be addicted to a behavior? Exploring the effects of rewarding behaviors on the brain. And first, I want to just do a couple of public service announcements. We are recording this event, so it will be recorded and then promulgated and posted on our e-catalog page along with Dr. Giordano's book. And we will be taking questions. However, all of you are muted. So if you do have questions for Dr. Giordano, please put them in the Q&A box. And we will be monitoring those questions and posing your questions to Dr. Giordano at the conclusion of her talk today. So yes, this is being recorded. You are muted, but we are happy to be taking your questions. And I'm going to, again, my name is Rhonda Dearborn. I'm the editor for behavioral sciences here at Springer Publishing Company, and I'm very, very proud to be introducing Dr. Amanda Giordano today. She is a licensed professional counselor, an associate professor at the University of Georgia. She is the sole author of the book titled A Clinical Guide to Treating Behavioral Addictions, Conceptualizations, Assessments, and Clinical Strategies. That is published by Springer Publishing Company, and co-author of the soon-to-be-published textbook, Addiction Counseling, A Practical Approach. Dr. Giordano works to advance the counseling field with rigorous research and has published over 45 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters. In 2018, she was awarded the Addictions Offender Educator Excellence Award from the International Association of Addictions and Offender Counselors. Dr. Giordano specializes in both chemical and behavioral addictions and is passionate about raising awareness regarding the identification and treatment of addictive behaviors. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Amanda.
Great. All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this presentation. Thank you for spending some time with us today. I am so excited about this topic. I think it's something that all counselors and all counselor educators should be aware of. Anyone working in the mental health field is going to be affected by behavioral addictions in some way. So I'm very passionate about trying to raise awareness about this topic. We're going to cover as much as we can in the time that we have today. So I'll present for about 30 to 35 minutes, and then we'll have time for question and answer at the end. If we don't have time to answer all the questions, my email address is on the last slide as well. So please feel free to reach out to me and we can continue the conversation. Again, this is a topic that I feel really strongly about, and so I'm happy to engage in dialogue with you even after this presentation. So what we're going to cover today, just starting off of why is it important to learn about behavioral addictions. We're going to talk about the evolving definition of addiction, how to conceptualize addiction. I'll share with you a public health model of behavioral addictions that can be useful in your practice as you conceptualize and assess and treat behavioral addictions. And then we'll talk about how to identify behavioral addictions and specifically how to differentiate between high involvement in a behavior and a behavioral addiction. And then we'll end with some Q&A. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. This is my shameless plug slide where I really want all counselors, regardless of setting, to see this as an important topic to learn about, rather than just a specialty area for some counselors or some folks who want to work in the addictions field. I truly believe that all counselors should be able to recognize behavioral addictions, to assess and respond appropriately. And I say this because if you look at the prevalence rates of behavioral addictions and the trends that are ever increasing, I think it is very unlikely that a mental health professional would go through their career without addressing a behavioral addiction. And if they don't know how to recognize it and they don't know how to respond to it, they might not see any treatment gains in their work because they're not addressing the primary issue, which could be a behavioral addiction. We also know that shame and stigma exists with all addictions. I think in particular with behavioral addictions, there are extra layers of shame and stigma. So clients might not disclose their behavioral addictions. It might be something that the counselor instead has to hear those signs and symptoms and those red flags that enables them to then assess for whether or not a behavioral addiction exists. So this is something I think all counselors should know. I incorporate it into all of my classes, human development, and even theories and basic skills. I just think it's important for us all to be aware of behavioral addictions. And you can see some of the prevalence rates here on the remainder of this slide. We know that chemical addiction is prevalent. Sometimes it co-occurs with behavioral addictions. We know that both chemical and behavioral addictions co-occur with other mental health concerns. And just like chemical addictions, behavioral addictions can lead to a host of negative consequences. So it's really important that we're able to identify it in our clinical work. You can see some of the prevalence rates here, that sex addiction ranges from 3 to up to almost 17% in the literature, depending on the makeup of the sample. We know that age of first pornography exposure is 12 years old, and that number continues to decrease. Globally, up to 5.5% of children and adolescents have an internet gaming addiction. So not just that they game, it's that they actually have met criteria for internet gaming addiction. And in some countries, the prevalence of gambling addiction among adolescents is as high as almost 8%. When you think about how things continually evolve with technology and also with sports betting, fantasy sports, daily fantasy sports betting, we're seeing these prevalence rates continue to rise. So let's talk about how the definition of addiction has evolved over time. So the American Society of Addiction Medicine, which is the organization for addiction professionals, they introduced the idea that rewarding behaviors could be addictive in their 2011 definition of addiction. And that definition has been retained in their 2019 official definition. So the American Society of Addiction Medicine, which is one of the more prominent and vocal organizations to speak to what addiction is, they recognize and have for years that both behaviors and substances can lead to addiction. We also see changes in some of the most prevalent diagnostic manuals. So the DSM-5 that has recently come out has a chapter entitled Substance-Related and Addictive Disorders. So even in that title, we see that it is recognized that not all addictive disorders have to involve a substance. Some could be substanceless and they can just involve a behavior. The first behavioral addiction to be included in that chapter is gambling disorder. That was a real step forward in acknowledging behavioral addictions, is the inclusion of gambling disorder in the DSM-5 in this chapter. Although not listed in the DSM proper, there are a few other behavioral addictions that have been proposed that are currently in section 3 of the DSM, which is the section for proposed diagnoses that need further exploration and research. So internet gaming disorder and non-suicidal self-injury disorder are both listed in section 3. And it's believed that they will eventually get into the DSM proper with more neuroscience research in particular. Although not as popular in the United States, the International Classification of Diseases by the World Health Organization is used across the world, and it includes a section called Disorders Due to Addictive Behaviors. So very clearly recognizing the legitimacy of addictive behaviors. They have codes for gambling disorder as well as gaming disorder. So gaming disorder is already recognized by the ICD. Also, compulsive sexual behavior disorder is included in the ICD-11 in the section for impulse control disorders. So again, huge steps forward for the behavioral addictions field, recognizing that both gaming and sex addiction exist and can be problematic for subsets of the population. I also just wanted to mention for those of you who work at a CACREP accredited institution, the CACREP, the Council for Accreditation of Counseling and Related Educational Programs, included in their 2016 standards that all professional counselors in training should understand the etiology of addiction and addictive behaviors. So it needs to be covered in CACREP accredited programs as well. So all of these organizations and diagnostic manuals are recognizing the validity of behavioral addictions. And I think that that is a great reason why counselors across the field in different settings should recognize them as well. You saw from the previous slide with some of those prevalence rates that whether you work in a school with adolescents, whether you work in the community, in private practice, these behavioral addictions impact individuals across the lifespan. So I think, again, regardless of setting, we all need to be aware of behavioral addictions. So I would like to spend some time talking about a way to think about behavioral addictions. And I think one of the best ways to do this is by applying a public health model. And I'm not the first one to suggest this. You can see the citations here at the bottom of the slide. But when we apply it specifically to behavioral addictions, we really see that this public health model gives us a holistic picture of behavioral addictions and can really help guide our treatment. So this is coming from, again, the public health field, the epidemiologic triad that talks about the spread of infectious diseases. So from this model, the agent is the pathogen or the infectious disease. The host is the susceptible individual who contracts the disease. And then the environment are all of those external factors that contribute to the spread of the disease. There's a fourth element, so a little outside of the triad, but a fourth element called vector, and that is the stimulus that transmits the agent to the host. So that transmits that pathogen to the susceptible individual, and that can be things like a mosquito or a tick. So that is how this model was originally used. It has since been applied to the disease of addiction, specifically chemical addiction, and we want to apply it today to the disorder of behavioral addictions. So let's take a look at how this model can help us conceptualize behavioral addictions. When applied to behavioral addictions, the agent is the rewarding behavior. So remember, the agent is originally the pathogen for the infectious disease. When applied to behavioral addictions, it's the rewarding behavior. Now, I typically get asked the question, can all behaviors potentially become addictions, especially behaviors that are repeated? And the answer to that is no. Those potentially addictive behaviors are the ones that activate the brain's reward circuitry. So this is really important. People don't tend to develop an addiction to folding laundry or brushing their teeth, even though they do it repetitively. Instead, the potentially addictive behaviors are those that activate the certain regions in our brain known as the reward pathway or the reward system. And this is all centered around the mesolimbic dopamine system. So we've all heard of dopamine. That is a neurotransmitter, a neurochemical in our brain that is implicated in the experience of reward. So the dopamine system is where dopamine is released and how it travels through the brain. When a particular behavior activates this circuitry or activates this pathway, that behavior is extremely rewarding. And the brain is smart enough to pay attention to what behaviors activate the reward pathway and then repeat those behaviors in the future. That's why things like eating and sexual activity are naturally rewarding, because it increases the odds that we're going to repeat those behaviors in the future and continue our species. So there are quite a few rewarding behaviors that activate this part of the brain. And it's also the same part of the brain that's activated by drugs of abuse. So things like gaming, pornography use, shopping, and other highly stimulating behaviors can all impact this reward circuitry. So the agent in this model, the potentially addictive behaviors, are those that are rewarding, those that activate the reward circuitry, specifically the mesolimbic dopaminergic system. So in essence, people say, well, how can you have addiction if you're not ingesting something? You're not taking in a chemical from the outside when we talk about behavioral addictions. Instead, the brain is responding to the release of endogenous chemicals, our own neurotransmitters that are implicated in reward. So things like gambling activate dopamine release, and that becomes the process of reward that can in turn become addictive. We know that the reward pathway is an important part of our experience of wanting a particular behavior, liking a particular behavior, learning what gave us those feelings of wanting and liking, and then being motivated to seek out those behaviors again. And that's really how this cycle of addiction continues. All agents, all potentially addictive behaviors, rewarding behaviors, are both positively and negatively reinforcing. So this is important for us to think about. If you remember back to when you learned about behaviorism in a theories class, positive reinforcement is adding on something desirable that increases the probability that the behavior will be repeated in the future. So if you engage in activity like gaming and it feels good, you enjoy it, there's a sense of euphoria or pleasure, that's positive reinforcement. Negative reinforcement is taking away something undesirable in order to increase the probability that the behavior will be repeated in the future. So negative reinforcement might look like if an individual is gaming and it takes away their stress, their anxiety, their worry about their problems, their feelings of insecurity or feeling social anxiety with people offline. If that is taken away while someone escapes into a game, that's negative reinforcement. So these rewarding behaviors are both positively and negatively reinforcing. Now, what we see with addiction across the board, chemical and behavioral, is a shift over time from being motivated by positive reinforcement at the beginning to primarily negative reinforcement later on as the addiction develops. So what that means is individuals engage in these behaviors at first because of their rewarding and pleasurable and euphoric properties, like engaging in porn use that might feel exciting or arousing. Over time, as the brain adapts to the chronic activation of the reward circuitry, there is a downregulation of the dopamine system. And what that means is the brain may respond to the chronic activation of the reward center by decreasing the natural production of dopamine, decreasing transporters or receptors that are all part of the neurotransmission process of dopamine. So what that means is that an individual may at baseline feel a sense of dysphoria or malaise simply due to the downregulation of their dopamine system. So now they're engaging in this rewarding behavior, not to feel the high, not to feel the euphoria, but simply just to feel okay or to ward off symptoms of withdrawal. And that's what we see for individuals who are engaging in these behaviors. And they say things like, I don't even really enjoy it anymore. I just need to use pornography or I need to gamble just to feel okay, because their dopamine system and their reward system has been downregulated from chronic use. So those are neuroadaptations. Our brain is really smart, and when it notices spikes in dopamine and chronic activation, the brain is going to respond by trying to get back to a balanced state, homeostasis, equilibrium, and that could mean the downregulation of the dopamine system through the reduced production. So that's really important for us to think about how the brain is changing in response to these behavioral addictions, because these rewarding behaviors are activating that specific area of the brain, the reward pathway. Now, we know that there are natural and learned rewards that activate that same circuitry. Those natural rewards are the things that we're already wired to find pleasurable. So sexual activity, eating, drinking when we're thirsty, those types of things. But we also learn what's rewarding. So we learn that getting a notification on our phone telling us that we have a like on a social media account gives us social rewards. It may give us a feeling of, oh, someone likes what I did, that makes me feel good, and that becomes a learned reward. Escaping into internet games and losing track of time and forgetting about all other worries and really becoming immersed into a virtual world where you feel more competent, that's a learned reward. So these agents can be either natural or learned rewards. And one of the constructs that really impacted the way I now talk about behavioral addictions and think about behavioral addictions is this idea of supernormal stimuli. So a supernormal stimulus is basically an artificial exaggeration of a natural instinct. So it is, and there's a lot of science backing up why this is, but if you have something that is naturally rewarding and then it is artificially exaggerated and it becomes more potent or more rewarding than the natural stimulus, we know that animals and humans will be drawn to that supernormal stimulus over the natural stimulus. So let me give you a couple of examples. Processed sugar is considered a supernormal stimulus. Consider the sweetness of a peach or a strawberry, and then consider the sweetness of a donut or hard candy or a pixie stick with this refined concentrated sugar. It is going to overwhelm the natural sweetness of a strawberry because it's artificially exaggerated, it's more potent, and so that is actually going to be more rewarding than the natural stimulus itself. So people will be drawn to these supernormal stimuli. Another example is pornography. So the natural rewards of an offline potential sexual partner compared to the novelty of online sexual partners that are available 24/7, that are always new, always willing to engage in sexual acts. Pornography is seen as a supernormal stimulus. It is an artificial exaggeration of the natural instinct to engage in sexual activity. Even gambling, when we look at electronic gambling machines and how they have been created to entice all of our senses and keep us in this zone of play, there are very few natural instances where that takes place. Instead, this is an artificial exaggeration. So part of the reason why we're seeing the uptick in all of these behavioral addictions is the introduction of supernormal stimuli that are much more rewarding than natural stimuli. So you can see the list here of potential addictive behaviors. Some have more neuroscience and research than others, but these are the ones that have been proposed most often. And there's a chapter of each in the Treating Behavioral Addictions book that I was able to publish. And we were able to look at each one of these in terms of how to conceptualize, how to assess, and how to treat these particular addictive behaviors. Okay, so that was the agent. Remember, the agent is the pathogen in terms of behavioral addictions. The agent is the rewarding behavior. Now, the host is the susceptible individual. So from the public health model, that is the individual that's susceptible to the pathogen. In the behavioral addictions model, this is the individual that is susceptible to addiction. Another question that I hear quite often is, so does anyone who engages in a potentially addictive behavior, are they doomed to develop a behavioral addiction? And the answer is no. Not everyone responds to these potentially addictive behaviors in the same way. And there are a couple of hypotheses about why that might be. One is reward deficiency syndrome. So this is the hypothesis that some individuals are born with an underactive reward system. So that reward pathway, the reward circuitry we just talked about, they're born with some sort of deficiency in one or more neurotransmitters, in receptors and transporters. There's something that is creating a deficiency state for them in their reward pathway from birth. So these individuals go through life with an underactive reward system, meaning they don't feel the same sense of reward and euphoria that others feel to just natural rewards. It leaves them in what's been described as a craving state, looking for rewards because their reward circuitry is not functioning to the same capacity as someone who didn't have a deficiency. So when they come across one of these rewarding behaviors, especially interacting with a supernormal stimulus, it stimulates this underactive dopamine system, and they may feel a level of euphoria that they have not felt before. I think this really helps us have empathy for people with behavioral addictions. When we start to realize that the experience of gambling or the experience of sexual activity or the experience of gaming actually feels different from person to person. It can be variable based on genetics. Now, we know that genetics is not the full picture, it's just a part of the picture, but it's an important part of the picture. When people say, I have a genetic predisposition to addiction, they could be talking about this hypothesis that their reward system was deficient from birth, and that led to the experience of euphoria and pleasure and reward when they were introduced to these potentially addictive behaviors that others might not have felt. And so once they experience that, it's actually really hard to walk away from because they activated their reward pathway in a way that hadn't been activated before. Along with genetics, we know that some people become more susceptible to addiction and addictive behaviors because of a history of trauma. And why that is because that toxic stress, adverse childhood experiences, trauma early in life can lead to a dysregulated stress response system. So we know that if a threat is present, our stress response system is activated, our body releases the hormones of cortisol and adrenaline, and we're ready to fight or run. And then the threat goes away and we return back to baseline. For those individuals who maybe grew up in a household where the threat was constant, this is called toxic stress. So the threat never goes away. So perhaps they're living with someone who is abusive, or they're in a dangerous situation over time and it's chronic. Those individuals may have a dysregulated stress response system that lasts into adulthood. So what that means is that this individual has a stress response system that's chronically activated. They're always ready for fight or flight. So they're hypervigilant. They always have the release of the stress hormones that's causing their body just to be in a state of tension and anxiety and on the lookout. So rewarding behaviors, if a person with a dysregulated stress response system is now in their young adult years and they're introduced to gaming, or they're introduced to pornography, or they're introduced to social media, and they're able to calm themselves down or escape from the hypervigilance or escape from the tension just momentarily, that can be really powerful. So these individuals can turn to rewarding behaviors as their primary means of emotion regulation. So these individuals can find an escape. So that's that negative reinforcement from their dysregulated stress response by engaging in some of these rewarding behaviors. In the original ACEs study, so adverse childhood experiences, the researchers found that trauma during childhood, so the number of adverse childhood experiences, significantly linked to adult substance use, more sexual partners, obesity, and gambling. So it gives a little bit of credence to this idea that if you have a dysregulated stress response and you have been exposed to early trauma, you may be using drugs of abuse, sex, food, or gambling as a means of changing the way that you feel. So these are just some of the things that could make the host particularly susceptible to behavioral addictions. Okay, so what about the environment? We know that the availability and accessibility of potentially addictive behaviors is very much going to impact what behaviors people who maybe have a genetic predisposition become addicted to. So those countries and cultures that have a lot of technology access, Wi-Fi is readily available, smartphones are very prevalent, you're going to see more instances of social media addiction, gaming addiction, gambling addiction, porn addiction, all of those things that you can do online, shopping addiction as well. And now sports betting and other forms of gambling are taking place online more often. the legal considerations of a particular community or culture or country. So think of the legality of gambling, pornography, sexual activities. All of those are going to impact just the availability of behavioral addictions and thus which ones individuals might encounter more frequently. And I mentioned they're changing laws related to sports betting right now in the United States. We're seeing a lot of states allowing sports betting to take place, which is going to have an impact on gambling addiction numbers in the next couple of years. So as these laws change and policies change, we see differences in the prevalence rates of behavioral addictions. Also, what behaviors are modeled for individuals. So if a child sees a community member or a family member engage in a potentially addictive behavior as a means of changing the way that they feel, that's where social learning can take place, and they can start to anticipate and have expectations that that particular behavior is going to change the way I feel as well. Marketing and advertising plays a big role in this. And we know that just like with alcohol and tobacco, there are some targeting behaviors. So particularly impoverished areas, you may see more electronic gambling machines than you do in more affluent areas. And then finally, just the norms of that particular community. So social approval or social disapproval. So we know in some cultures and some communities, overworking is celebrated. It's something that people take pride in. Over exercise is the same way, where in other cultures and communities, there's not that same approval from society. So these can be more hidden behavioral addictions in societies where it's seen as not only welcome, but celebrated. Okay, so the last aspect of this public health model, we have the agent, we have the host, we have the environment. The last one is vector. And like I said at the beginning, this is the mechanism for transmitting the pathogen to the susceptible individual. So for infectious diseases, this can be some sort of insect. For chemical addiction, this could be a drug dealer, someone who connects a susceptible individual with a drug of abuse. For behavioral addictions, vectors can include any organizations, businesses, people who connect the public or susceptible individuals to these potentially addictive behaviors. So think about pornography organizations or websites, the platforms that we use for social media, all of the sports betting and online gambling platforms, casinos. There's a variety of vectors that are making a profit from keeping individuals engaging in particular behaviors. So the goal of the vector is not always or necessarily even at all in the best interest of the public or individuals. Instead, the goal is to keep individuals engaged, to keep them checking their social media accounts, to keep them gaming for longer periods of time. And they use a variety of strategies to do this. There's a lot published right now about the specific strategies that tap into our dopamine system to keep us checking social media. So getting a notification, even while we're driving, that someone has liked one of our pictures or sent us a message, causes a little spike of dopamine to say, oh, there's a reward there waiting for me, or not knowing when a reward is coming. So it keeps us checking, and that's that variable ratio reinforcement scheduling, just like gambling, that we know the reward is coming, but we don't know when. All of those strategies keep us engaged, and they're being used very intentionally by vectors to keep susceptible individuals engaged in the behavior. So all that to say, I think it is so important for counselors and mental health professionals to embrace their role as advocates. So there may be things that we need to do to help regulate some policies, to change laws, to influence how some of these behavioral addictions play out in our society. How old do you need to be before you can engage in some of these behaviors? Does there need to be some sort of preventative or education about the behavior before engagement, so people know when they might be losing control or need to seek help? Okay, so just to kind of put it all together here, the public health model for behavioral addictions is comprised of the nature of the rewarding behavior. So it's impacting our reward system in our brains, specifically the dopamine system. The susceptible individual, or the host, which is the individual who either through genetics or life experiences is more vulnerable to developing a behavioral addiction. The nature of the environment that makes that particular potentially addictive behavior available or accessible or modeled for the individual. And then the vector. So those things that connect agents to hosts. How do hosts even become exposed to these rewarding behaviors, and what vectors are at play? I think this model can be really helpful for us as we think about behavioral addictions in our work, because it's not just the individual, it's not just the behavior, it's really the combination of all four of these things that leads to a behavioral addiction. All right, so I know we're running low on time, so I just wanted to introduce ways to identify behavioral addictions. And I think this is really important because one of the fears of recognizing behavioral addictions that I hear from some folks is we're just going to start pathologizing everything. And that's really not the heart or intention of recognizing behavioral addictions. Rather than just high engagement in a behavior or high involvement in a behavior, behavioral addictions are going to have some of these hallmarks. So let's look at two quick ways to recognize behavioral addictions. The first is the 4 C's model of addiction. So if you are talking to a client and you are hearing that their engagement in a potentially addictive behavior, so a rewarding behavior, becomes compulsive, they have lost control over their engagement in this behavior, they're continuing to engage despite negative consequences, either financially or in their relationships or at their job or in their educational pursuits or their health. And then when they're not engaging in the behavior, they're experiencing cravings or they're mentally preoccupied with the behavior. If those 4 C's are present, that should alert the counselor or the mental health professional to do more assessment for behavioral addictions. And there are a lot of psychometrically sound formal assessments that I'll show you on an upcoming slide that we can use to really assess if a behavioral addiction is present. Along with the 4 C's model, I really like this components model as well that Griffiths promoted really in 2005. And if all 6 of these components are present, then that should indicate that this is not just high involvement in a behavior, this is a behavioral addiction. So if the behavior becomes the most salient thing in the individual's life, if their life seems to orbit around this particular behavior, if it causes conflict both within the individual and with others, if it's used primarily for mood modification. So remember how these behaviors are both positively and negatively reinforcing. So if the individual is relying primarily on this behavior as their means of emotion regulation, if they experience tolerance and withdrawal. So just like drugs of abuse, if you are chronically engaging in a rewarding behavior and activating your reward pathway, you are going to experience that downregulation of the dopamine system, which means you're going to need more of that behavior, either more intensity, more frequency, more novel, in order to cause that same spike of dopamine and get that same effect. Also, we know that there's withdrawal with behavioral addiction. So if someone has chronically engaged in pornography over time and has a sex or pornography addiction, and then they all of a sudden stop, there's all sorts of withdrawal symptoms that's related to anxiety, not being able to sleep, feeling irritable, restlessness, and then finally relapse. So if a person sets their own limits and is not able to keep them. So if you're working with a client who says, I promised myself I was going to go 1 month without using pornography and I didn't make it 5 days, that would be considered a relapse and would cause us to think about a behavioral addiction. I just wanted you to see just some of the instruments available to help us assess for behavioral addictions. So I've heard from some students and a couple of folks I've at presentations that I just wish there were more, and there are more assessments. And I respond by, there's a lot of them. It just doesn't seem like everyone knows about them. Like we're not being taught, we're not teaching future counselors about these assessment instruments. But you can see everything from gaming to social media to love addiction to gambling, exercise addiction. We have scales available to help us make these types of assessments. I also think it's really important to note that we have a variety of 12-step programs for behavioral addictions. And just when people think 12-step, they think Alcoholics Anonymous. And just like Alcoholics Anonymous, these 12-step programs have meetings and sponsors and a primary text. As part of the Treating Behavioral Addictions book, I reached out to members of each of these 12-step programs and was able to hear how the program works, how it offers support to individuals with these different behavioral addictions. And they so very much want professionals to be aware that these 12-step programs exist so we can make referrals. And I think just the sheer number of them is another piece of evidence for the prevalence of behavioral addictions in our society. And finally, obviously, we're not going to get to all the different ways you can treat behavioral addictions today, but I want you to know that there's a lot of ways you can get prepared to do this. So there are trainings and certifications and manuals and specializations, published workbooks, continuing education opportunities. You can become a certified sex addiction therapist. You can get your credentials in gambling disorder treatment. So there's a lot of things you can do if you feel like I want more training in this area. Although I'm not going to get into the specifics of treatment, I did just want to note that people with addiction, whether chemical or behavioral, are really they're addicted to changing the way that they feel. So they can do that through rewarding behaviors or drugs of abuse. So part of treatment that I've found is just common in the treatment approaches for all these behavioral addictions is helping our clients develop emotion regulation skills. So that ability to influence their emotion by using internal or external strategies. There is a very clear link in the literature between deficits in emotion regulation and addiction. So part of treatment is going to include helping our clients develop more emotion regulation skills. And that could also potentially be a prevention effort, is if we were to teach emotion regulation skills to children at a young age to make sure they have this skill set before they're introduced to potentially addictive behaviors. Okay, so I think I'm right at time, but I'm very open to answering any of your questions, and then we can move forward.
Good afternoon. My name is Lee Montville. I'm with Springer Publishing Company. Thank you, Dr. Giordano, for your excellent presentation today. We had a lot of questions, so we will get to as many as we can. Before we ask the questions, I just want to let people know that if you're interested in adopting Dr. Giordano's book, or you're interested in the upcoming addiction counseling book, you can reach out to our teams here at Springer Publishing Company for the sales reps. You'll see the link in the slide there, springerpub.com/educators. If you're interested in purchasing Dr. Giordano's book today, you can feel free to visit us at springerpub.com and use the code Giordano25, and you will get 25% off plus free shipping. And then if you have any other questions about Springer products or services, please feel free to visit our website or email me at lmontville@springerpub.com. And finally, to reach out to Dr. Giordano, if we don't get to your question today, or you have any other questions regarding Dr. Giordano's presentation, please feel free to reach out to her, amanda.giordano@uga.edu. So, Dr. Giordano, first question was, how do you categorize a behavior addiction treatment for insurance claim?
Yeah, so that is a great question, and actually something that I include in each chapter of the book are diagnostic considerations. So I speak to what clinicians typically use as a diagnosis if that's something that's needed for insurance claims, and that's either from the DSM or if you use the ICD-11, what options you have. But if it's a behavioral addiction that's not recognized by the DSM or the ICD-11, I provide information regarding typical diagnoses that are used, and that could either be a co-occurring substance use disorder or a co-occurring serious mental health concern, but also there are some others that can be used that really include impulse control issues that might be not otherwise specified. But that's a tricky one. And that's one of the reasons why people are advocating for these diagnoses to end up in the DSM so that people can bill insurance. But so I tried to include that in each chapter. And I talked to a lot of clinicians who specialize in each behavioral addiction and asked them how they deal with insurance. And so got a lot of responses from them about diagnosing the co-occurring disorder or diagnosing the substance use disorder or an impulse control disorder. So it really varies depending on the specific behavioral addiction.
Thanks so much. The next question is, if a client expressed that they did have an addiction to folding laundry, for example, might you instead think that they had a compulsive behavior rather than an addiction?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I get asked this a lot, like on airplanes when I'm flying and people ask what I do. And I say I specialize in addiction, particularly behavioral addictions. They start naming the things that they do a lot of and then ask me if I think they have a behavioral addiction. So I like to skydive a lot. Do you think I have a behavioral addiction? If someone is engaging in a behavior repetitively, that doesn't alert me to a behavioral addiction. But if I hear those 4 C's, if it's compulsive for that individual, if they've lost control over their engagement, if they're continuing despite negative consequences and they're craving it, then that's when I'm going to start thinking of a behavioral addiction. If those 4 C's are not present or the 6 components are not present, then yes, I'm looking at other things. I might look at some sort of compulsivity or an impulse control issue, or actually there's a host of different things it could be. If they're experiencing some sort of distress or impairment due to a repetitive behavior that doesn't fit the addiction model, then yes, I'd be looking at other potential issues and diagnoses.
Great. The next question we have is, do people ever get addicted to substances through the reward system? So they are addicted to the behavior of using a substance, i.e. alcohol or marijuana, but not necessarily physically addicted. If so, how do you discriminate if their substance use is a substance addiction or behavior addiction? And would you treat these addictions differently?
Mm-hmm. So you cut out a little bit at the very beginning. Can you repeat the first part?
Sure. Do people ever get addicted to substances through the reward system, so they are addicted to the behavior of using the substance, i.e. alcohol or marijuana?
Yeah, so drugs of abuse, alcohol, marijuana, they are drugs of abuse because they activate the reward pathway. That's why things like Advil or Prozac, they're not considered drugs of abuse because they're not impacting the same part of the brain as cocaine or meth or alcohol. So if a person is using a drug of abuse, they are activating their reward pathway. So yes, it's the behavior of using marijuana, but it's the actual chemical that's coming from outside of the body, like the marijuana or the cocaine, that is impacting the reward pathway. So that would be a substance use disorder rather than a behavioral addiction. The behavioral addiction would be if a outside substance is not present and they're really becoming addicted to the change in their reward pathway because of a rewarding behavior that's activating it, not a chemical from the outside coming in and activating the reward pathway. So I hear what you're saying, and yes, there's a little bit of overlap there, but there is a distinction between if the chemical that becomes the addictive substance is a neurotransmitter that originates inside the body that's activated by a behavior, or if it's a chemical from outside of the body that's impacting the reward pathway and interfering with neurotransmission like drugs of abuse do.
Great. Thank you so much. The next question we have is, can an addictive behavior go on and off over time, meaning that the individual overcomes the behavioral addiction, but then gets triggered after a few months? Would unsatisfaction of a need, i.e. sex, in a relationship lead to development of a compensatory addictive behavior?
I love this question. I wish we had a lot of time and I could explain this in more detail, but what you're describing is a relapse in a behavioral addiction. So if you think about sex or eating or shopping, recovery and abstinence is going to look different, right, than a drug of abuse, because you're not just going to cut out sex or shopping or the internet from your life. Instead, working with a counselor or working with a sponsor, the individual is going to identify what are those compulsive, out of control behaviors that lead to negative consequences. And that's what I'm going to abstain from. And so you develop a recovery plan, just like you do with chemical addiction, to help that person avoid triggers, to regulate their emotions in different ways, to cope in different ways. So you are helping them abstain from what they identified as those compulsive, out of control behaviors that lead to negative consequences. The relapse rates with behavioral addictions are very similar to chemical addictions. You see that relapse is a very common part of the process because the individual has been relying on a behavior like pornography use or sex as their primary means of changing how they feel for maybe years. And so now they have to relearn how to engage with the world without relying on that compulsive behavior and allow their brain to go back to baseline so that they are affected by natural rewards again, that they start to rely on natural rewards rather than these supernormal stimuli. And that takes time. It takes maybe a couple of tries before they really get a recovery plan that works for them. So yes, it definitely can be a period of active addiction and then a period of abstinence and then a relapse back into active addiction, just like with chemical addiction.
Amanda, this is Rhonda. Would you say that the COVID pandemic has impacted folks with their relapse, where they might have been okay for a while with help and therapy, but because of these extraordinary circumstances, they might have been impacted?
Yeah, so the research that's coming out now is showing that almost all addictive behaviors have risen, some substantially during COVID. So the lack of structure, the lack of 12-step meetings, in person, a lot of them moved online, but it's not always the same impact. The lack of accountability, the lack of routine, as well as additional stress and anxiety and fear because of these global events can really be very difficult for people with addiction. And so I just collected data from school counselors asking them about their experience with students who have internet gaming addiction and asked them if in their professional opinions, they've seen an uptick in internet gaming addiction during COVID. And the large majority of participants said yes, that they are seeing much more problematic gaming and consequences from internet gaming addiction during COVID than they did before COVID. So, and we know that alcohol sales and tobacco, all forms of addiction have trends that are increasing during COVID.
Great. Thank you so much. We have a couple more quick questions. Where would thrill seekers or extreme sports enthusiasts fit into this model? Is it borderline appropriate behavior?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And that's some of the controversy around behavioral addictions is, again, are we just going to start pathologizing everything? Thrill seekers, people who, jump out of airplanes and like to, climb cliffs and things like that. And again, it's not just the nature of the behavior. That's just one piece of the puzzle. You have to look at the individual's relationship with that behavior. So again, coming back to the 4 C's, if they have lost control over that thrilling behavior, if they are compulsively engaging and they've had a host of negative consequences, but they're continuing, then yes, I think if it is a rewarding, thrilling behavior, it can become addictive for certain individuals. But we can't determine an addiction simply by the nature of the behavior, because a lot of people could engage in thrill-seeking behaviors and not have negative consequences and not lose control, and it doesn't become compulsive for them. So I think when people say that the idea of behavioral addictions is just going to over-pathologize everything, I think that's an issue of not understanding the hallmarks of a behavioral addiction and not being able to assess and recognize it, so that we may call things a behavioral addiction that really don't meet the criteria. So I think, and as we come up with more diagnostic criteria too, this will become easier. But right now, I think that components model and the 4 C's help us see, is this just a person who engages in thrilling behavior? Is this a person who's highly involved in their work or highly involved in exercise? Or is it a behavioral addiction?
Wonderful. Thank you for that answer. We have 2 more questions. First is, what is the difference between a compulsion and an addiction?
Yeah, and so there's been several articles written about this same exact question. Should we be saying addiction? Should we be saying a compulsive behavior? Should we be saying it's an impulse control issue? All of those terms have slightly different meanings, but why I like the addiction model is really because of that positive and negative reinforcement idea. So that from the addiction model, the rewarding behavior is not just compulsive, but it actually is positively and negatively reinforcing. So it's causing some sort of pleasure or euphoria or a high or ability, to feel something good, but it's also helping the individual escape something, which is the mood modification piece of the components model. That's a little bit different than a compulsion or impulse control disorder, is that you're using it for emotion regulation. So the motive is a little bit different. There is overlap between all of these terms, and I definitely have colleagues who fall in different places and will use different language, like compulsive sexual behavior as opposed to a sex addiction. To me, I think the addiction model makes the most sense and has a lot of empirical support. So that's why I land there. But yeah, there's a lot of papers written on this exact question and really highlights the subtle differences between each of those terms. But when you get to being primarily motivated to change the way that you feel through positive and negative reinforcement by activating the reward pathway, all of that is the addiction model. So it just seems like a really clear fit for me.
Great. And the final question we have is, do you think we will be seeing more elective or even required course offerings in mental health and addictions counseling graduate programs, and maybe in other specialties when it comes to courses on behavioral addictions?
I very much hope so. I think it is almost impossible to cover everything that mental health professionals need to know about addictions in one course. I was very fortunate to have the opportunity to teach a behavioral addictions elective at an institution, and it was very well received. And I still get emails from students in that class saying, thank you, because I work at a school and I know how to deal with internet gaming addiction, or thank you because I have my first client with sex addiction and I have a framework for it. So I think KCREP standards are telling us we need to address this. Prevalence rates and what clinicians are saying is what's walking through their doors in their office is telling us we need this type of preparation. I think that a basic addictions class and then potentially an advanced addictions class where you cover the specific behaviors would be wonderful in counselor training programs. I also know that not all counselor training programs have the space and the room to do that. So part of what I feel like my advocacy work is, and what I'm kind of called to do, is to create opportunities for continuing education. But if it was happening in grad school, it would just be, I think, so much better for preparing clients for what they're actually going to see. I got an email from a former student not too long ago where she now specializes in sex addiction, never had any training in sex addiction in her graduate program. She had to do all of her study post-graduation. It was just self-study. And then she started going to as many presentations and conferences that she could about sex addiction. And now that's all she sees. She only works with sex addiction. And she said it just is funny to her that it wasn't even mentioned in her counselor training program. But I hope with KCREP standards and these prevalence rates, we try to build it in. Like I infuse it in my human development class. I talk about how in adolescence, a lot of these potentially addictive behaviors are very available. And we see a lot of this starting at adolescence. So I hope that counselor educators will find ways to infuse it into their programs.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Giordano. Well, we're at the end of our hour. I want to thank on behalf of Dr. Giordano and everybody with the Springer team, thank you all for attending. Thank you all for your questions and your kind comments and words in our chat. I just want to reiterate that we will be sending out a link to the webinar recording within 7 to 10 days. The recording will also be on our website. And if you have any other questions, please feel free to let us know. As you've seen here, the information is on this slide. Thank you again, Dr. Giordano, and we wish everyone a great afternoon. Thanks.